I believed, maybe it's old school, that your job is to go out and look at things and talk to people and let them tell you the story. And so I never stopped doing that. Maybe younger journalists or places where their papers or publications or websites sort of demand that they feed the news in a certain way. I just don't report that way. People can really feel piled on or humiliated or embarrassed or exposed. And people are, I get it. I mean, people are afraid. People are tired. They just want to kind of call things as they see them. And that sort of bled over into media, where they had the power because of Twitter and the internet to kind of, get you to lose your job. Our job is to ask questions. And I thought Ta-Nehisi Coates behaved very well in that situation. Why the people inside CBS had a problem with them is a leftover position of feeling that they can, for anything that gets them either real or fakely upset, that they can displace people. I consider it a very illegitimate form of power. You may ask me a question and I'm like, damn, I don't know. Well, okay, let's get into it. Let's do it. Friction is interesting, right? The book is called 40 Bucks and a Dream, Stories from Los Angeles. It is basically lots of different, it's a collection of reporting and first person essays about what LA is, on the surface and under the surface. The massage story is actually my husband, who was a painting contractor, was waiting for his paycheck. And the gal said to him, well, I can't give it to you right now because my boss is getting a massage. And it's just this sort of idea that, you all exist on these different stratas, and the people that are like the lotus eaters are living over here, and you're the little plebe that's maybe mowing their lawn. But the stories for me that were so amazing was both writing about the person that feels it's like, I'm entitled to get a massage and make people wait. And I worked for a week with a Mexican gardening crew. LA is a fabulous place to write from. Another guy comes in and he's like, I broke my leg, and I got to tell you, you know what? My mother-in-law has been driving me crazy. And that's why I was up on that ladder. And you know what? And then my car broke down, and it's like, he needs to talk. All right. Your cousin believes that it is his gig to advance the ball down either the progressive side or the far right side. Okay. You know what? He's allowed to do that. I'm also allowed to call that not journalism. People are confused by free speech. They feel intimidated. And if they're terrible ideas, they're going to die. If you ban the bad ideas, they're just going to go underground and get really gross and come out in terrible and perhaps violent ways. Trump was a really divisive figure, and people on both sides, we sort of made enemies of our fellow Americans. But when COVID happened and everybody was completely sequestered, and then George Floyd was killed, people really, there was an explosion, but we stopped seeing certain kinds of violence as violence and calling it free speech. When you are breaking people's windows or setting fires, there has to be some kind of consequence. I don't think that they're out there protesting because they want their vote. They're out there protesting because it feels really great. Some of them do care. And I actually had a conversation with someone the other day who's very involved in the pro-Palestinian movement. And I told him I was upset that what happened, what I saw on October 7th, the violence and the hatred. He said, you are correct. I've written about people who've lost children, people who have murdered children, or just people in very tough circumstances. And you go and you sit with them, and you almost do feel a little bit that like you're sharing a circulatory system. And then you go back to your hotel room and you're exhausted.
Hi, today's October 11, 2024. I'm honored to have with me Nancy Rommelmann. I hope I said that correctly.
You did.
And she is doing actual journalism. It's an amazing thing. She probably does keep a literal journal. I wouldn't put it past her, because I've read some of her LA stories, and they're just, she has great turn of phrase, and it would be a shame if she didn't keep a diary and a journal. So Nancy, tell us a little bit about where you find yourself these days, in the mix of reporting, and whatever happened to the rest of journalism.
Well, good morning, Randy Bach. Thanks for having me. What happened to the rest of journalism? I'm sure we've always had partisan journalism. I mean, of course we have, you've got, back in the day, this paper reports this way and this paper reports this way. But I think just from my perspective, and I've been a journalist for about 30 years now, around 2015, things, especially like when Trump became the nominee and some earlier sort of culture war stuff before then, people really felt it was necessary, excuse me, to take a side. And if you weren't taking a side, then you were helping the other guy win. I mean, we see this now too in any sort of election season. And I just never thought that that was my job as a journalist. I believed, maybe it's old school, that your job is to go out and look at things and talk to people and let them tell you the story. And so I never stopped doing that. And there are certainly people that still report this way. But I think maybe sometimes, maybe younger journalists or places where their papers or publications or websites sort of demand that they feed the news in a certain way, like we're going to put it through this filter so that our people will really understand what they're being told. I just don't report that way. And I'm just super, super lucky to be able to write for Reason and The Atlantic and other places that are like, no, we trust you to bring us the story. You might like it, you might not like it, but this is at least what I'm seeing. So I don't think it's so remarkable, but apparently it's shoe leather reporting is getting a little less common these days.
Yeah. I mean, I went to, as it turns out, some pretty elite schools. Wasn't really thinking about it at the time, but I went to Horace Mann School in New York City, and then Yale University, and medical school, and so forth. And I really didn't see myself as one of the smarter kids at the first two, at the very least, and probably at the third. A lot of hardworking people and whatnot. But after the fact, I go to various reunions, and it just seems that people come up to me and they whisper in my ears, I really like what you're doing. I like what you're thinking. Da, da, da. It's like I don't really think that I'm thinking that much or that hard, but I do let the thoughts take me where they will. And it seems that people have kind of blinkered, or what do they put those things in bumpers that they put in the bowling alley, so the ball only rolls down a certain way, and they don't necessarily allow themselves a certain type of thought. I don't mind people having their political opinions. I mean, that's kind of who we are. But it's when it's part of your job. If I walk in as a physician and I have kind of a preconceived notion of how I want to treat a person, right, I think you're missing the moment, the objectivity of listening to what that person's complaining about. I might see a mole on the center of somebody's forehead, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to attack that. I'm an anti-mole, and I think it looks terrible, blah, blah, blah. But the person actually coming in for something different, and right, that they see that as a beauty mark or whatever. It's like you cannot necessarily be successful in the long run applying and framing everything with your own kind of preconceived filter.
Well, let's see. I mean, some people can. Some people make a complete brand of doing that. You look at like an Alex Jones or something, let's say, right?
Right.
I think that's what we call in journalism trimming the facts to fit the theory, or going in with this preconceived idea. This is what this story is going to be. This is what I need this story to be, what my publication needs it to be, what the zeitgeist needs it to be, and I'm going to do that. I don't even really think of this as journalism. In terms of people being willing to speak their mind, we live in an environment where people can really feel piled on or humiliated or embarrassed or exposed. And I get it. I mean, people are afraid. And they, wherever they were on the political spectrum, whether it was Trump or COVID or, whatever it was, they didn't want to get piled on. So I understand people like not saying anything, or, attacking other people before they feel that they can be attacked. I also think that, at least in my world, and perhaps in yours too, you will get a lot of people coming up to you and saying, listen, I really, think what you're doing is interesting, but I maybe can't be as forward about it. And that's fine. You don't need people to come and, congratulate you for just saying it how you think it is. But I think it has become a slightly rarer commodity lately, but I kind of have faith that we're going back a little bit. People are tired. People are tired of not being able to kind of call things as they see it, because they feel politically or culturally it's going to get them piled on. I think people just want to kind of call things as they see them.
Yeah. I do think there's probably a market aspect. I think it's been slow. Markets can be somewhat controlled and siloed and barricaded from from the public. I mean, obviously there's the bureaucracy, for instance, which is a marketplace of some sort. People have jobs, they get paid, and whatnot, but they seem to be impenetrable to public opinion. But the press, when something's a utility, it's often immune from scrutiny or public change. I mean, I might not like the way my electricity gets to my house, but what am I going to do about it? I can't really protest. I can't find a competitor and so forth. With news, a fair amount of that has been in the same kind of passive bureaucratic sense, where people just got it. I mean, I am old enough. We just had like 3 channels. I mean, we had the two, 4, and 5, and then there were some other minor ones on VHF or UHF, whatever it was, and now people have kind of a so there's a little bit more of a utility aspect to various aspects of the news. Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley report or whatever back in the Neanderthal period when little pterodactyls and T-Rex were around. Anyway, but I think people are choosing, people, in the old, Soviet or whatever, people, if they could, they would vote with their feet, they would leave. And I think people vote with their eyeballs and their clickers and their mice to move away from things that don't provide adequate, product. I think it's slow because people kind of glom onto things they love. We fall in love with things and we keep with it. But obviously right now you're writing for Reason and you're writing for Atlantic. And you seem to have found a niche kind of as a freelancer, but I don't think that it's come some of the, say, more utility legacy media have that liberty. I mean, there's this, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, but there's a current controversy with Tony Dokapil vis-a-vis Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing either of those names correct. Right. Yeah, but where things are, again, being filtered or are funneled in a certain way. And if you say something, it may not hit the news waves. Have you found any of that yourself? And do you get kind of bumper guards?
Sure. I mean, we saw this really in 2020, just when people really lost their minds about a lot of things. And, we were scared, and George Floyd and Trump and COVID, and it was a difficult time. And there was a lot of people really actually afraid. And that sort of bled over into media, where if you said something that people perceived as not culturally appropriate or dangerous health-wise, they had the power, because of Twitter and the internet, to kind of, get you to lose your job, which was really a bad time. We're seeing this now, like you're saying, at CBS, and they're trying to get Tony pushed out of there because people are crying and they're calling in, people to like navigate everybody who has these hurt feelings. But had this been 3 or 4 years ago, he may already have been out. Now I think people are just making fun of this. This is ridiculous. This was a very legitimate, strong position to take, to challenge one of your guests on the book that he wrote. Now, let's just be clear. All right, let's be very clear. Ta-Nehisi Coates has been on the cover of multiple magazines. He has had so many glowing reviews. He is almost untouchable. So for one person to say, listen, I'm kind of curious why you don't think it's important to mention October 7th, why you don't think it's important to mention these things. This is actually a journalist's job. This is a journalist doing journalism. Now, I'm just saying, sort of the royal we, can say, we want to say we're afraid of journalism. We're afraid of it. We're afraid to do it. We would rather give all of our guests tongue baths and just make them, put them in the shiniest, rosiest light. Or depending on who we are, it doesn't even matter politically or sexually or morally or anything. Just like, we have questions. That's our job. Our job is to ask questions. Ta-Nehisi Coates didn't need to answer them. I thought it was very civil. And I thought Ta-Nehisi Coates behaved very well in that situation. Why the people inside CBS had a problem with them is a leftover position of feeling that they can, for anything that gets them either real or fakely upset, that they can displace people. Like, this is a form of power. And it is, I consider it a very illegitimate form of power. But it's still being committed. But I think people are having less and less tolerance for it. I don't think we're going to see it as often.
Well, you've heard of the Streisand effect?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I had to look it up. I've seen it, mentioned all the time with the CBS 60 Minutes Kamala Harris, um, edited. um, and apparently, Barbara Streisand, whenever it was, 10, 15 years ago, whatever,
Longer.
she didn't like a reporter pointing out her mansion or whatever. And
Right.
so she sued him or something. I don't know. And of course, it's like picking at a scab. It just doesn't fix it. It just made
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
worse and overgrow. And so when you don't want attention, the best thing is lay low. But the thing that's happening with CBS regarding Ta-Nehisi Coates is is pursuant to the George Floyd riots. They kind of overhauled their news department. They should have just renamed it. But has to go through some race and equity-ish, filter, and they've got people there, which are basically the commissars, and the producers, they said that this report hadn't gone through that modality or that, meat grinder or whatever, and it should have been kind of pulled before it reached the air because it didn't whatever. It hadn't gone through their racial office.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that that's true. I mean, I believe that there are definitely some institutions where these things are in place, certainly at universities, and, they may at some news organizations. And of course, there's certain things we don't, say because they're absolutely vile, or, certain words we don't use. But I have to tell you, and I could be wrong here. I don't know. I haven't read the report that you read. To say that at CBS, every single question that every reporter asks every single guest must first be vetted. This is impossible. You're not going to be able to run a news channel, period, if you do that.
Well, you can't do it live, but you can cut things later.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, do we want to make everything less interesting? Do we want to never, ever, ever have a conversation that's a bit challenging and challenge people? I mean, I'm here having a conversation with you. You may ask me a question and I'm like, damn, I don't know. Well, okay, let's get into it. Let's do it. Friction is interesting, right? And it's going to unearth more things than just like giving your interview subject a little, massage. I'm not interested in that. And I don't think your viewers would be interested in that. So bring it on, Randy Bach.
Yeah. Well, speaking of massage, I read the word massage from one of your writings today, and it's from the LA book. I can't remember the name of the book.
I'm going to push it. It came out 2 weeks ago.
I'm going to put it out. I'll put it up in a second.
Sure.
But you talk about the guy who decided to leave LA because he couldn't stand waiting around for his paycheck because his intermediary was getting
Yes.
massage from her boss,
Yeah.
and so forth.
Yeah.
So what are your LA experience, and where did you get that one from?
What are my LA experiences? Well, I lived in LA for 18 years, and that's where I became a journalist writing for the great LA Weekly, which doesn't really exist anymore. It was a great alternative weekly, and the LA Times and a lot of other places. The book is called 40 Bucks and a Dream, Stories from Los Angeles. It is basically lots of different, it's a collection of reporting and first person essays about what LA is, on the surface and under the surface. Why do people go to LA? They go to LA or they used to go to LA because they wanted to be famous or because that was where their dream was. That's where their real life was. Like, I might be actually a waitress in Schenectady, but I really believe that if I'm up on the silver screen, I will receive love and adulation. And actually that already exists. My real life is someplace else. And where is it? It's in Los Angeles. And so you're just going to go to Los Angeles and your real life is going to be waiting for you, which is why I went to LA to become a movie star, which of course didn't happen, which I'm so grateful didn't happen. But in any case, what really fuels LA is sort of a disillusionment in some ways and failure, but also striving. And it's a fantastic place to report from. The massage story is actually my husband, who was a painting contractor, was waiting for his paycheck. And they said, no, come back, tomorrow or later. And he did. And he came back and the gal said to him, well, I can't give it to you right now because my boss is getting a massage and she needs to write the check. And he's like, no, you're going to go get me my goddamn check. And it's just this sort of idea that, you all exist on these different stratas, and the people that are like the lotus eaters neighbors are living over here and you're the little plebe that's maybe mowing their lawn. But the stories for me that were so amazing was both writing about the person that feels it's like, I'm entitled to get a massage and make people wait. And I worked for a week with a Mexican gardening crew, and these people's lives and how they got here and the dreams and what you never see, but it's all right there. LA is a fabulous place to write from. And the book is, I think people will enjoy it.
I'm enjoying it. I got to buy a copy. I'm gonna have, if I get the physical copy, you're gonna have to sign it for me. But,
sure, of course. Of course.
No, you have great stories. I read. I was at Alex, the skinny British guy, cuckold.
Oh yeah, in the that's the title. The title of the piece, $40 and a Dream, is about this motel on Sunset Boulevard that at the time cost about $40 a night, and he came from England, and he was living there because he'd been cuckolded and had been suicidal, and he was just living there, and he sort of he opened up his world to me. They all do. This is the thing. Okay, first of all, just in general, people want to tell you their stories. They do. Almost everybody. But in Hollywood, oh, come on, man. You just show up and like, I want to hear about your life. They're like, oh, please, I want to tell you about my life. So that was a fascinating story to stay at that motel and just like talk to people, not behind all the doors, but behind about 10 or 12 of them. And they're just, every single one is completely different. And that's a good piece.
So give me your, there's a knock, knock joke. Give me your knock, knock line. I mean, knock, knock, I'm Nancy, I'm a reporter, or how do you get people to?
I don't do that right away. So what I did is I decided to stay at the motel. I already lived in LA, but I drove by it 50 kajillion times. I decided to stay, and I spent the first day or so kind of looking at people, just kind of sucking it all in. And there were some people by the pool, including like this kind of starlet looking girl, and then this guy who was sunning himself in a tiny little G-string.
Yeah,
and
I read that. I had that was tough.
So I just said, he's going to talk to me. So I think he was the first person I talked to. I was like, hey, John, and his name was John, and told me a story. And of course, half of it is just, it's ridiculous. And it's probably not true. It's fine. They're telling me their story. This is different. This piece is different than like a piece of journalism that you're going to fact check. And, oh, did you really graduate in 1989? All that kind of stuff. This is just like, tell me your story. Tell me why you're here, and I'll just sort of be the mirror and write it. So, and then, you meet a few more people, and then you talk to the manager, and then there's a guy walking down the hall. So you don't really need to land on people. And I can't remember if there was anyone's door I knocked on and they said no. I don't think so. I don't think anybody said no.
Yeah, no, I find the narratives are fascinating. I was a science and math kind of guy. I graduated chemistry and physics, BS. But in medical school, there was a lot of stuff thrown at you. It wasn't kind of learning that I liked, which is hunting for things. And you're kind of the goose, and your knowledge is your liver, and they kind of force feed in order to make foie gras.
Yeah.
They just kind of forced a lot of things down your gullet, and then your knowledge is that new fatty liver you have. So I wound up kind of being enamored of psychiatry, because when I did the clerkships, and everything else had been kind of Q&A. You learn you learn 40 things, and then you get quizzed on whatever. You have to kind of be able to do the mental switchboarding of making the right connections for things, which is okay. It's a game kind of thing that we either succeed or don't. But when it comes to psychiatry, it was like you talk to people, and it's like, oh, it's not just, oh, I have blood in my urine, I have this wart on my forehead, whatever. It's this kind of thing happened. I was I am the Lord incarnate, and I whatever. You're hearing voices and all this kind of stuff. It's like, whoa, this is we all have brains and they're all anatomic, but there's something that's kind of, all these stories are either bubbling over or inadequate or whatever. It's kind of like a weird place to go into, and I thought that was kind of a fascinating role. I didn't wind up staying in psychiatry. I wound up doing general medical care, but either way, it's kind of the stories that wind up being the lines. Even though people have, say just that blood in the urine problem, they want that fixed, or they have the splinter in their finger. Obviously, there's some easy, obvious cases where it's just like, don't take that out. I'm all better. I don't need to chat. But a lot of things, when you hear it, it's like that people can have the same issue, in 20 different people, but they're approaching it and have fears over it on 20 different levels, and 20 different levels of urgency or not. And it's kind of that part that makes medicine interesting. And I didn't think it would be that way. I kind of had no thoughts of doing primary care when I was in medical school, and we're all kind of geared towards becoming specialists in one type or another. But it was kind of a funny thing. It's a little bit like your stories. I mean, except the stories would come at me, and I wasn't always infinitely receptive. I wasn't like the the prototypical teenage girl writing exclamation marks in the margins. But at the right moments, people want to talk about things. You can have interesting stories just on the side about stuff, and that's kind of what kept it fresh for me through the years. But it's like I appreciate that you kind of have this fresh eye. So on a personal basis, how do you a cameraman needs to keep his lens clean, so that you don't want dust on it and so forth. And whatever it is, a basketball player needs to have a fluid jump shot and so forth. They practice and so forth. What's your practice, and how do you wind up finding the right moment for the story? I mean, clearly it's an inspiration to be at to check into the hotel or motel. Where do you come upon that, and what's kind of the risk factor that you put yourself in, especially with riots and all kinds of democracy being perpetrated en masse these days?
Well, it's a bunch of things. It's you have to keep it's to use be poetic. You have to keep your aperture open. You have to want to look at things. You also have to follow what's curious to you. I've said this many times. So some of the stories, the stories that in fact have turned into books. My last book was called "To the Bridge: A True Story of Motherhood and Murder," because I saw a small little item in the Oregonian newspaper saying "Woman throws kids off bridge" in Portland when I lived in Portland, and I was like, wait, what? And, everybody else, because they were daily news writers, meaning, daily newspaper, they, the next day and then in the days following, it's like, this is what happened. This is where it happened. She's been caught. And then the reactions, she's crazy. She's evil. Hang her from the bridge, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, none of this answers the question. None of this answers the question for me, which is, how did this happen? So, I wound up following that story for 6 years and writing a book about it. So it's especially when stories are being reported one way, and I look at it and think I don't think that's how it is. So that's one way. Also, I find beats, as you mentioned. I have been writing about the protests. I started writing about the protests in Portland in 2019 when I moved from Portland back to New York City, where I'm from. And then, of course, in 2020, we had the bonanza of protests in Portland, and I stayed very closely on those. And now that has become a beat. I went to the DNC recently and covered the protests there. I've been covering what's been going on here in New York. I just wrote a piece about what happened on October 7th. I'm working on another one right now on the anniversary of October 7th. You just become fascinated. And also, stories are not static. The protests I covered in 2019 are extremely different from the protests I'm covering now. And not just because what they're fighting for or against is different, but the actual movement itself are sort of it's its own organism that changes over time. So it's just sort of what interests me. And, as I said, most people will talk to you if you're interested in speaking with them. Now, you were saying something very interesting a moment ago about like your patients. Some of them, like somebody comes in with a broken leg, right? One guy's just like, yeah, doc, I broke my leg. I fell off the ladder. Boom. He doesn't want to know anything more. Your job is to fix the leg and bye-bye. Another guy comes in and he's like, I broke my leg, and I got to tell you, you know what? My mother-in-law has been driving me crazy, and that's why I was up on that ladder. And you know what? And then my car broke down, and it's like, he needs to talk. All right. And it's a broken leg is not just a broken leg. Right. So it's the same with journalism. People want to tell you. And even when I've said this a billion times, even when they're lying to you, they're telling you their story. So right. It's never not interesting. And it's your job to really listen and mark it down as well as you can. And I think I have the best job in the world, of course, because I'm interested in hearing people's stories. And when will you ever run out of material? You'll never
right.
run out of material.
Well, yeah, the material might run out of you. If you're, I mean, there are these communists marching in Philadelphia. I saw, at some point, they might not allow journalism. I'm just saying, a natural endpoint. I spent some time behind the Iron Curtain in the 80s, about 3-4 weeks, bicycling at times with my now wife. And when you looked at a newspaper there, it was technically paper, but there wasn't any real news. It's a kind of an oddity to me that so many people in the press, and I have have a reasonably close relative who was a journalist and went to Columbia School of Journalism, so he's officially branded journalist. I'll give you the.
We don't have those. None of my friends have that.
Well, that's good. I'll give you the anecdote. I was talking to him once and about something, and he was between jobs, and I told him, he had a long period of time at Columbia, having gone to undergraduate there and then lived in the neighborhood, and he knew people who's very connected. Columbia, and he was between jobs. It was 2007 or so, and Barack Obama was running. And I said, well, he went to Columbia. Nobody knows anything about him at Columbia. Why don't you just do a quick little piece, and see what comes up with it? And he's like, I would never do that. It's like, dude, you're between jobs. This could, be an article easily, and you have so many connections. He says, I would never ever do that. It's like, why? He says, well, you're a moron. I'm like, okay, I'm a moron, but why? He says, well, because you're an idiot. You don't understand. I said, okay, fine. Leaving me out of this equation, why can't you do it? It's journalism. He says, well, you don't understand what journalism is, moron.
I'm sorry, I missed what you said. What story were you telling him to write about Columbia?
Barack Obama graduated from Columbia undergrad. He went from Occidental and he went as a transfer student to Columbia, but there's like no physical record of his being there. Nobody has any recollections of him. He had a Pakistani roommate. He maybe lived off campus, etc. But there's not. And I'm like, well, just do, Obama at Columbia. Like, what's so hard about it? He says, well, we might find some things bad about him, and that would derail his ascent.
So your cousin's not a journalist then. He's not. He is an advocate for.
Yeah.
So,
and he said,
I mean, it's his choice. So, I mean,
I'm just going to give the telling quote here. He said. So I said, so enlighten me. What is journalism? He says, journalism is a matter of moving the political football down the progressive field till we score, till we take over, the institution, etc. So basically,
he really said that.
And the irony for me is that the progressive end I've seen, if you go to North Korea now, or the pre-wall overturned Soviet, you'll find that there is no real journalism. It's just a matter of becoming another bureaucrat. That's a functionary.
Well, okay. There are definitely publications that baldly believe this, whether you're moving it down the right side of the field or the left side of the field. We know this. This is very obvious, and they don't make any bones about it. They can pretend to be like, yes, we're the only people that tell the truth. But yeah, if I had $1 for every new news organization that's telling me that they're the only ones that are telling me the truth, I'd go on a trip to Bermuda. But okay, I have a podcast. Everybody should go listen to my podcast with my great podcast partner, Sarah Heppola. She's a great journalist in Dallas. And it's called Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em. Go ahead and listen to it. But we sometimes have this conversation because I'm like, that's not journalism. She's like, Nancy, journalism is what you make it. And I guess that's true. If we decided en masse, or because the government made us decide, or we all got hit in the head with a rock, that journalism was only this thing where you supported one team and nothing else, then okay, that would be journalism. But that's not what journalism is. And there's plenty of people that practice it in other ways. Your cousin believes that it is his gig to advance the ball down either the progressive side or the far right side. Okay, you know what? He's allowed to do that. I'm also allowed to call that not journalism. And if someone else wants to call it journalism, then that's fine. It's not how I practice it. I don't think it's that interesting, because what are you really trying? Okay, why am I here? Okay, why am I here on this planet doing this job? I feel it is my job to go out and find stories that you might not find, whether I'm talking to a chef making a cake or I'm talking to someone on death row, which I have. I interviewed John Wayne Gacy before he was executed. It is my job to walk into this particular environment, do the very best I can, and bring it to you, the reader, who I am going to assume is smarter than I am. And you can make a decision yourself. It is not my job to take you by the back of the neck and stick your nose in the trough of the one that I and my organization has decided is correct. Now, if maybe I will go the way of the dodo and we will not have this anymore. But I'm going to tell you, people want to hear stories. They want to hear stories that they find challenging and interesting and dynamic. They don't want to hear that. They might think they want to hear the same story over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, but I don't think they do. So I'm going to keep doing my job till someone tells me there's no more work for me, and that will be never.
Right. So there was a piece in the Atlantic. I didn't copy it down for this, but forget who it is, who said that aren't we? I think we're done with free speech. Free speech needs to be.
What?
I mean, this is an impossibility. I'll see if I can find it while you're speaking. But free speech needs to be managed, and of course that's an oxymoron right there. I mean, you can't. That's like it can't be that if it's this. So if it's managed, it's not free. And I'll see if I can pull it up. But there seems to be this tendency that free speech is danger. Danger. Triggers, warnings. Rights. There are a lot of things that are multiple winner games. I think free trade has multiple winners.
Mm-hmm.
One team doesn't have a center and needs a guard, and another team has lots of guards and no center. Or if I said that right, anyway, they trade the guard for the center. They're both better, and that's the way. Oddly enough, Adam Smith kind of documented that people, get wealthier through trade, and so ideas are the same thing.
Absolutely.
And people learn the things they can't do. People sit and watch YouTube videos because they don't know how to plug in the router, and they don't. But when you have that information, you got wealthier essentially. You're able to do other tasks because you had that trade of information. Now you might have had to watch an ad, and maybe you're going to go buy some gum or candy, whatever that you wouldn't. Who knows? But it's only by this trade that people get smarter. We have the same physical tools as the Neanderthals did. We have the same natural environment pretty much, but we've taken rocks, sand and lightning and made it into computers, and we're able to do far more things, and we have more people doing more things. They may not realize their happiness, but they should, because they're not Neanderthals or cavemen and so forth. But what's the point here? This kind of, it has to come through discourse, and so this kind of managing of speech is inimical to the project. And I think as you kind of mentioned, it's not journalism anymore. But certainly you must have heard that people are worried about free speech.
Sure, of course. I mean, I write for a reason. This is like one of the main things that they're always talking about. People are confused by free speech, and they're confused by it because when they feel that they are either afraid of what the other side is saying or afraid that the other side, which is also, come on, do we live in a world where there are two sides? There are it's innumerable prismatic sides in this world, and it'll be a better world if we all enjoy those. They feel intimidated. They don't want the other guy to have a leg up. They feel offended by certain words or by certain ideas. Well, too bad. As the great Jonathan Rauch wrote, he's like, what was it? The direct quote. It's like something about like, I'm sorry if you're offended by what I said, but you'll survive. You'll survive. You can hear things that might offend your ears, might offend your idea of decorum, might go against everything you believe. And if they're terrible ideas, they're going to die. They're going to get into the ring with the better ideas, and they're going to die. So let that happen. And if you don't I'm saying something that everybody knows. If you ban the bad ideas, they're just going to go underground and get really gross and come out in terrible and perhaps violent ways. I am pretty much of a free speech absolutist. I also, it's very rare that I take offense at someone said. I just think they're probably like dumb or sick or but I will defend anybody's right to pretty much say anything.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think that's the way people mostly are going to act. There's a certain amount of politeness that is intrinsic to our genome and to say animals in general. The famous, well, it's not famous, but this tiny little video I saw, I think it's instructive, and it actually happened with my dogs the other day. There's a video of two dogs on either side of a fence, and they're like, they're barking, going crazy, whatever. And some guy comes along and he opens the gate, and the dogs are just kind of like they pull aside.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's kind of an easier aspect of just yelling at each other anonymously. In this case, they don't have names, but to each other. But the fact that they can scream without repercussions. So when the door opens and they actually have to confront each other in a physical way, they both back off. They're just like, and then as soon as the guy shuts the door again, they're back. And it's
by the way, I just want to interject that the book I was talking about, the Jonathan Rauch quote, which of course I bungled, is called Kindly Inquisitors. And it's a fabulous book. And it really does talk about why we need to have free speech and why it's just going to be so much more joyous. It is going to create so much more good stuff if we stop putting the lid on ideas that we might be afraid of, or we just think the other guy shouldn't be allowed to talk about. So. Good book.
Now, I've had George Gilder on my show a few times, and he wrote Life After Capitalism, Life After Google. He's got a bunch of these things. He's in his 80s now, and a brilliant guy. And it's basically, he thinks that the whole engine of our progress has been free speech. That again, his example was the caveman with sand, and the same. Sand and lightning and whatnot, and it's only through free speech, through this kind of exchange, that people are able to move things ahead and progress in the literal sense, not the progressive sense per se of just kind of progressing your political mindset and control. So we're 40 minutes in, and I'd like to kind of hear, I guess, two things. I mean, I'd like to hear kind of current events. You're in New York, and you're in Portland. I'd like to hear what gives, what's going on, what's the progress, to use that word again, of kind of these agitprop propaganda maneuvers and so forth that's going on in New York. All these kind of scenes that are playing out. War seems to have taken on kind of a multi-dimensional aspect where it's not just on the battlefield in the Middle East and Ukraine, whatever. It's on the city streets where it can be. And you had a quote from one of your pieces, a guy, about democracy, which I just tweeted, that, he's yelling about democracy and through a bullhorn. And this is what democracy is: loud and repetitive and getting to say what you want. I had a babysitter, a guy, teenager when I was young, and he used to yell at us, "Enough is too much," when we were like running around doing stuff. What's enough? Enough is too much. We want free speech, but do we have kind of this idea that democracy is just kind of a welcome mat that gets to be, you have welcome on it, but you get stepped on a lot, where there's other people's rights for concourse and to get from place to place without traffic jams, without being accosted, are being threatened. So what are the guardrails for not to limit speech per se, but to limit the actionability of say aggressive, intimidating, bullying in the physical, literal marketplace?
So I think what happened, going back again to, like, let's say 2019, 2020, I mean, Trump was a really divisive figure, and people on both sides, we sort of made enemies of our fellow Americans, which really I find really super disheartening, especially as a journalist who drives around the country and talks to all kinds of people and really just enjoys every kind of people wherever they are on the spectrum. But when COVID happened and everybody was completely sequestered, and then George Floyd was killed, people really, there was an explosion, and that explosion sort of dovetailed with more progressive DAs in big cities where we wanted to do better policing. We wanted to do better, less incarceration. A lot of things that make sense if you can make them work. Of course, you have to work toward making them work. But we stopped seeing certain kinds of violence as violence and calling it free speech because we were so emotionally invested and so upset. And so I covered Portland, and I watched a lot of destruction, and I watched that destruction have no consequences. And I watched the not having consequences be celebrated. Now, I am not saying at all that I think every protester should be arrested. I don't, absolutely. I do believe, when you are breaking people's windows or setting fires, there has to be some kind of consequence. I mean, there was a little Thai restaurant near the federal building in Portland, and I was out there reporting. Like, I was out there every night, but then I was there like at 5:30 in the morning to watch the cleanup. There was a guy who specialized in this stuff. This was now his gig. This window had been broken like 11 times. This is like a little family business. They can't stay open. And so is that really free speech? Is it free speech that their window continually gets broken and they go out of business or could go out of business? I think that we have to draw a line at physical violence and the destruction of property. And that's something we are still wrestling with. I will say I have really seen the protests change from something where people wanted to not be known. They didn't want to know. They didn't want people to know where they were going to be protesting. To now, it's become a very. They announce it in advance, exactly where they're going to be, and they expect not only for there to be no consequences, but they expect them to be celebrated. We are the good people. We are the people here, trying to stop the war and the death in Gaza. It's been interesting to see some violence ramp up, which I saw on the anniversary of October 7th. It was kind of disheartening. And I really do wonder where it is going to go now. We are seeing a weird cessation of interest but a weird ramping up of the more violent parts of the interest. And that I find concerning. I find it concerning that we may see people that they're not receiving the celebration they think that they should for being the, in air quotes, good people that are saving the citizens of Gaza. I wonder what they're going to do with their energies. I've read the very, very great book, and everybody else should too, called Days of Rage by Brian Burrow, which chronicled a lot of the radical underground movements in the United States in the 70s and 80s. And when there was a lot of bombings, and that was the way you were going to get your message across. And I worried that Portland was going to devolve into that if there were not consequences. We didn't have much of it. That one guy did go to prison because he threw an IED at federal agents. But I wonder what is going to happen with this current movement.
Yeah. So let me ask you like a literal question. Do you think Antifa is happy just with street protests, or do they have a greater goal of wanting and fomenting literal revolution?
I think, in my experience, and again, I'm not an expert on Antifa, in Portland, Oregon, where everybody was, the national media was shouting, Antifa, Antifa, Antifa. Most of the protesters out there were not Antifa. They were kids that dressed in black bloc that may have been part of some sort of like loose cells that they wanted. It was not some big, giant organized movement where they were, as far as I understand, receiving, hundreds of millions of dollars from secret organizations to overthrow the government. And the protesters I see here, for the pro-Palestinian protesters, in my understanding and experience, they are not Antifa at all. I mean, there may be some, and they are, they kind of dress the same. They're still masking their faces and in different ways. But I do not see this as a movement propelled by what we saw propelled in 2020 and 2021. I think we're talking about young people who always have a lot of energy. They have a lot of passion in what they're going to do, and they're going to do it right. And then they melt off and get married or go to graduate school, and they find the next cause. I
understand that. But every now and then there are literal revolutions. I mean, there's kind of been this, Marxist spirit long before Karl Marx existed. But, there were various attempts at revolution in Europe. and not all of them succeeded, but one famously did. And I'm not sure all of those guys were professionals per se, but once the movements happen, and they can take on a momentum of their own. So I wonder and worry about that, and like how much rope you can give to clearly radicalized, violent protests. I mean, there's peaceful protests and there's not.
Sure. But I think that if you're going to see like an actual revolution that overthrows things, you would need more coordination, certainly, than exists now. And I'll give you an example of that. When I went to the DNC to cover the protest, I wasn't in the arena. I was outside of the arena. I'd been in touch with the heads of the protests. They'd sent out multiple press releases. We were expecting 30,000, 60,000, 90,000 from 270 different organizations. I mean, every kind of organization was going to be there petitioning for their particular thing, whether it was, gay rights or Palestine or whatever, but they were going to be as one. Between 2,000 and 3,000 people showed up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That is not a revolution. And it was pretty tame. And I think this is one of the reasons why I say the people that organized it, they were caught off guard. I think they thought that they had a lot more mojo than they did. And I wonder what they do with that frustration. That sort of concerns me. But I don't see a massive revolution in this country, organized revolution to overthrow democracy. I think we're always going to have, and thank goodness we live in America. We're allowed to have all kinds of movements here, right? I mean, that's part of the joy of being here, is our freedom to be idiots too. So I think that we're just going to continue for the rest of our lifetimes to see different people popping up, but I don't see it as one big wave that's coming to overthrow us all. I don't.
Yeah. So getting back to the kind of the analogy you gave about democracy, democracy. I guess the Greeks saw democracy as an issue. I mean, they invented it, and the word is Greek. But democracy is also three wolves and a sheep voting on dinner. There has to be some kind of framework. We don't actually live in a democracy. We live in a constitutional republic that has democracy at different points. We don't want democracy all the time because there's preservation of minority rights, and frankly, all the people that are protesting are, in a sense, minority splinters that want their rights, and they don't have the voting to do it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be out there protesting. So what I don't
know about that. I don't think that they're out there protesting because they want their vote. They're out there protesting because it feels really great to get into the streets and make your voices heard with a bunch of your peeps, and you put on the colors and you say the words, and you enter this sort of epiphanic pre-orgasmic state, which feels great. And I mean, some of them do care. And I actually had a conversation with someone the other day who's very involved in the pro-Palestinian movement. He's very somber. He's not a Yahoo. He doesn't break shit. And I told him I was upset that what I saw on October 7th, the violence and the hatred, and actually some pretty bald anti-Semitism, like right in front of my face. And I told him it was ugly. He agreed with me. He said, "You are correct." And I was like, what my hope for you as someone who really feels strongly about this is that you work quietly for change. And maybe it is about getting different votes as opposed to just going out there for the yay, we're in the streets experience, which I think a lot of them are there for.
Yes, I actually agree. I was smiling at your point about the kind of orgasmic part of groups. I for so many times I've used this very similar example. Everyone thinks when they get money, whatever, they want their own desert island or, mountaintop, resort or whatever. But in point of fact, people are actually happiest in groups. We are herd. Well, we're a tribal animal, and people actually like it when they can shed thinking, when they can outsource their thinking to the group, so they can be part of something. So if they're in a rock and roll or whatever Taylor Swift concert, and they I don't know, waving their phones and kind of swaying and thrumming, to use a word I just read from you today, to the crowd, and it's its own thing. Mosh pits. People when people are actually happiest is in crowds. And it's funny and inimical thing, because there's a certain amount of actually literally tactile experience, and there's so much going on around you. And I think it points to the fact about kind of the essence of what journalism is, to kind of provide that kind of excitement. If you're only getting the same, say, dog food every day, that's okay, you live, but it's
Right.
it's a zoo experience. It's being domesticated. And
Hmm.
what people actually like, the dogs too, is when they get that special thing. It'd be tiny little bit grubs off our plate, and it's something different from the dog food. So it's like, what could this possibly be? Oh my God, it's only vinaigrette salad. Oh well, but there
It's
you go.
different.
It's
Yep.
certainly different. And so it's this kind of self-imploding journalistic vision of having everyone go lockstep and hew to some bureaucratic concept of what truth is it's turn in your card. Like, it's not thinking, it's not genuine progress, and it's certainly not that helpful or fun.
Well, I will just tell your listeners, do not give up hope. There are just so many great journalists out there, and they're writing for the Atlantic, and they're writing for Reason, and there's still ones at the New York Times, and there's just people that are doing great stuff on Substack, and they are really going out there and like speaking their minds. You might like them, you might not. They're happy for you to argue with them. It's that we are here. We really are
So
still here.
we're almost done, but I have to kind of segue a little bit into your Michael Powell, is that the right name,
Oh,
interview.
Michael Powell, he's
Um,
fantastic.
you can chat about. I haven't actually listened / watched it yet, but I wonder. Reading it, I noticed he was talking about the denouement, sad leaving of Donald McNeil. And I got to tell you,
Oh,
I've got a Donald McNeil file. I've literally written on him for brownstone.org, and he and I have competing books on the Zika
okay.
pandemic. He kind of created it in a sense. He certainly fanned the flames, and he was using his journalistic, quote unquote, view as a bully pulpit to get Congress to spend $1 billion on Zika. He thought it was part of this climate change thing and whatnot. Zika has totally fizzled since, and he won't answer any of my emails. But his getting booted from the New York Times was certainly not what I would have wanted. I think that was an absurdity. I'm wondering, maybe you can talk about your time with Michael Powell, and very briefly, I didn't hear it. So what were his thoughts about Donald McNeil?
All right. So Michael Powell was a great journalist with the New York Times for a long time, and he jumped over to the Atlantic, I believe, last year. And Michael, as was I, as was many of my friends, I wrote 2 pieces for Newsweek. I wrote other pieces about Donald McNeil Jr. getting ushered out of the building. It's quite a long story, and we really don't have time to tell it here, but people can go and look up, Michael's piece on it, which was basically he went onto Twitter and defended Donald McNeil. And he got a total pile on from a lot of his colleagues at the New York Times as well. But he was also part of the union at that point. And at the New York Times Guild, the union was supposed to be defending Michael Powell. Donald McNeil Jr. And instead, they joined with the sort of activists inside the building at the New York Times to destroy Donald McNeil Jr. and get him out of the building. And they basically succeeded. It was a very, very, very shameful experience or incident, as far as I'm concerned, for the New York Times and for the executive editor at the time, Dean Baquet, who put out a statement like, well, context doesn't matter, because McNeil had used the N-word he had repeated the N-word back to a student that said it to him, asking a question. He was like, well, did this other student use it, as a slur, or was she saying it X, Y, and Z? It's a long story. It's part of all the downfall that people wanted in 2020. It was like off with everybody's heads because we're all just running around. Donald McNeil Jr., he started like a letter of sorts on medium.com, and you can go read the whole saga. It is, not everybody feels the way I feel or Michael Powell feels, or even that you feel, even if you disagree with, some of what he stands for. But it was a shameful episode in journalism, as
Oh,
far
I
as I'm
totally
concerned.
agree. No, I
Yeah.
literally have. I haven't written the book, but I have written the article.
Oh, great title. Wow.
The marvelous Mr. McNeil.
Good
Uh,
title.
Thank you very much. I follow him along from Zika to COVID. I think he said some pretty indefensible things. I think emboldened by his ability to be the tail wagging the dog on Zika and never getting called out for it. He consulted with Dr. Fauci early on. This is from February 2020 to take on the coronavirus, go medieval on it. Like everything medieval is so great that's quarantines and restrictions served a purpose in the old days. They can now too. This is not a good public health take. And it's unfortunate that our world devolved because of it. Donald McNeil was central to this. He had a podcast video going on in January, February, so forth, and really drummed up fear. This was a terrible, terrible thing he did. However, his being booted is, I think, the Andrew Cuomo mistake. It's like you do X, Y, and Z bad, you get, instead of for what your actual sins were, you get booted because you groped. Whatever. I think this is a kind of a standard way that on the left problems are eliminated. I'm not sure about Donald McNeil, whether he was a problem to be eliminated. I think his, quoting that word that is so often quoted, the reason, the actual question in this happened in Peru,
right?
I forget the year,
On a
but it was
student
way
trip.
prior, but it happened in Peru, and he was on a kind of a teaching thing, and he was, there as a journalist, and I think he's an excellent journalist, and I think he's a good writer. He's a very bright guy. I have not met him, but we have kind of a mutual friend who knows him pretty well and has played poker with him and so forth. Anyway, but what he was asked the question by a Peruvian, why
not a Peruvian, by a student on the trip.
Fair enough. Why is it that you can't use that word when it's in every rap song and people use it all the time?
Right.
That was the thing. And I thought it was not an American. I thought it was somebody from who wanted perspective about what it was.
Nope. It was, my understanding is, so these trips that the New York Times would sponsor for kind of like well-off kids. I mean,
I agree it was on the trip, but I think the question was from an international perspective. Doesn't it seem strange that you can't say this word when it's said over and over again throughout every, literally like 60% of rap songs? Like, why is it you can't say it? Why is it we can't say it?
Well, okay. So if I might, what happened was it was a girl on the trip who was quoting to Donald McNeil that she had a girl at her school, this is in America, who had said the N-word, blah, blah, blah. And McNeil went back to her. Now, you have to understand, McNeil's like 67 at this point. The girl's probably 17 or 15. And he asked her, he said, well, did she use the word or was she quoting it from something? And in asking her that, he said back to her what she'd said to him. And he had already been hauled before the New York Times HR or whatever, right after the trip, because some parents complained, and they were like, maybe bad judgment, but fine. It was a year later when everybody was losing their minds and easily canceling their colleagues. An activist class inside the Times had him basically tried again, double jeopardy. So that I only know this because I wrote a ton about it. I'm not trying to fact check you here.
No, I've spent more time than I should on the on him, but that's because let's see if I can find it here, because he has a let me see if I can put it
his site. Oh, Zika. That's
so
his book.
His book is Zika,
okay,
the emerging epidemic, and this was this is from his news reporting.
And what year was this? What year was this?
Well, Zika was erupted, as it were, as a concept in 2015 in Brazil.
I was going to say,
and he was writing in beginning early 2016.
Okay.
So it's similar to COVID in that it happened at the beginning of the calendar year, and my book is.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question though. Let me ask you a question, because I know he was very early on the train in terms of COVID, and now you're saying Zika. Is it the case that we just don't know what we know, and then we make these mistakes, especially in an emergency situation?
I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. Then he should come on and debate me and answer. I've offered him the spot on this minor forum here, and or to answer questions through email. He wanted people to not have kids throughout the Americas until there was a Zika vaccine. He was on board with this, what's the word, embargo? I can't think of that word, against childbirth. And he wanted, emergency abortions throughout Latin America. Now, it just so happens that the virus didn't cooperate by being as bad as he thought it was. It doesn't mean his ideas weren't crappy, and they still impinge and impact hundreds of millions of women throughout the tropics who think that a single mosquito bite is going to unalterably damage their cherished life within. And it just doesn't happen to be the case. So they do all kinds of things currently throughout the tropics, thinking that a mosquito bite is going to ruin their pregnancy. So they stay indoors, they slather insecticide or insect repellent and so forth, which has its own secondary issues and so forth. Anyway, other than that, I have no firm thoughts on the subject.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't have any comments about any of that because that's not my area of expertise.
No, I appreciate that. Anyway, I'm sorry to have tiraded there.
Yeah.
And I just think that it's an interesting thing that, journalism has power. There are people listening and reading and so forth. I really love your stuff because I think you are able to kind of bring the flavor of personality and actually of the moment there. That is, really a beautiful thing.
Well, thank you very much. I owe it to the people that let me write about them, right? In large part. But of course, anybody's interesting. I mean, I could sit with a guy who makes shoelaces for 2 hours and write about if he's committed to his work.
So who's your favorite actor?
My favorite actor?
Yeah.
You mean, let's see, what's his name? What's his name? Tom Hardy? Is that his name?
Oh yeah, he's great.
Just because he's so darn cute. I love De Niro. I don't know. I mostly hang around. I'm just reading a lot. That's what I do. You ask me who my favorite writers are.
I was hoping you would say Daniel Day-Lewis. Because
I mean, he's one of these like actors. I mean, he's great. I haven't seen him. I don't think he does movies anymore.
No, I don't think so. But I think he does things in acting that you do in journalism.
Whoa. Okay. Well,
because he's willing really to live the role that a lot of actors don't. A lot of actors want the role to come to them, and he's willing to kind of subsume his own personality into the construct of what he needs to do.
I'll say we can maybe end with this little story. So it definitely is the case, especially when you're doing a hard story. I've written about people who've lost children, people who have murdered children, or just people in very tough circumstances. And you go and you sit with them, and you almost do feel a little bit that like you're sharing a circulatory system, and then you go back to your hotel room and you're exhausted. But I did do a story a number of years ago about you probably remember this story, a young girl named Jessica Santillan, who received a botched heart-lung transplant at Duke University Medical. And it was because it was the wrong blood type, and she rejected, and then they found her another, and she did die. I think it was actually just a lung transplant. And I sank so far down into that story. Oh, something's dinging. That I wasn't actually myself for about 6 months. And my husband asked me at that point to not do that again. You definitely do want to shapeshift a little bit, and you want to have a lot of overlap. But if you completely subsume, it can be pretty,
it's a mess.
Pretty trying. So.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. I hope people follow you. I put up a couple of your books. I can maybe find your Substack if I'm quick.
It's nancyrommelmann.substack.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Nancy Rom, NancyRomm, and all my links are there. And I'm up on Reason, and I'm super. If someone says they can't find me, they're not looking. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks so much. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm going to let you go. I appreciate it.
Right.
Let me get your face back here. Thank you so much, Nancy. People should do well to follow you. You have great reporting. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.